Hello. Um, yeah, so my name's Minley. Um, I, my topic was Cuba. So, um, so Cuba was first inhabited by the Chiboni Taino people until Christopher Columbus discovered it, and it became a part of the Spanish colony in the 15th century. Wikipedia mentioned that about 20 to 30 years, two-thirds of the people were wiped out, and that's because of measles and smallpox. Uh, so I think Cuba is a lot like the United States. It has a really vast culture and history that's really based off of the countries that first claimed it as their own. So there's a lot to learn there. They're really not as different as kind of the stigma of communism makes them out to be. Um, So they have a really rich culture, including music, sports, religion, government. The New York Times article I found called Under Fidel Castro, Sports Symbolized Cuba's Strength and Vulnerability. It outlines how baseball was the main sport of Cuba, which honestly I didn't expect. I honestly thought it would be soccer or something. I kind of just, they speak Spanish, so obviously they like soccer there. I mean, they do like soccer, but it just surprised me that it was baseball. But the reason why baseball was so important to them is because baseball was so important to the United States. Baseball is very much a way for them to show off how successful they are, and especially to the United States, because the United States is such a powerful resource. They just wanted to show that they could be just as successful, even though they didn't. So, um, So for Cuba, sports represented a way to one up the United States when they were successful, but later on it just showed a state of their poverty and hardship. It says success in those sports allowed Mr. Castro to taunt and defy the United States on the diamond with and in the ring, and to infuse Cuban citizens with a sense of national pride. So, just like the United States, we find pride in our sports, our accomplishments. I'm from Texas, so I mean, like, football is my religion. But at the same time, internal isolation and difficult financial realities led to rampant defection of top baseball stars, the decrepit condition of stadiums, and shortage of equipment. So it's pretty much just the kind of the difference between uh, a public school and a private school. The public schools have all the shared equipment that kind of just sucks. The classic things that we see from a communist society. It's really unorganized, really gross. There's not a lot of people to take care of it because it's just all kind of general property. And when it's capitalism, or just when it's more taken care of, when it's more of a business perspective, like the United States, things are better taken care of. There's an industry for it. So, anyway, yeah. I didn't see this a lot, finding like the the communism versus anything else in the music part of the culture. From what I read, just music was a huge part of culture in Cuba. Again, Wikipedia just did. This was Wikipedia simple, which I learned existed. Wikipedia simple is just a lot more my wavelength. Music is a huge part of the culture in Cuba. Wikipedia gave a brief overview that describes how it's mostly derived from countries that settled it. So, Fernando Ortiz, the first great Cuban folklorist, described Cuba's musical innovations as arising from the interplay transculturization between African slaves settled on large sugar plantations and Spaniards from different regions. such as Andalusia and the Canary Islands. The African slaves and their descendants made many percussive instruments and preserved rhythms that they had known in their homeland. So they really took their culture and just brought it over. The most important instruments were the drums. They had 50 different types, which is low-key awesome. Bongos, congas, so kind of the classics that we know and see in movies. Um, the style of music in Cuba, so they kind of had two different styles, and it's evolved through the ages. They've had opera, they've had just kind of the same evolution that I've heard of in the United States, just from band classes that I've taken. Music really isn't a history of music really isn't a huge interest of mine, but from what I read here, Cuba kind of still had that same evolution cycle that we went through, which is kind of cool. So they had pianos, trumpets, soloists, and Cuba has kind of two different distinct ways to define music. They had the music for the peasants and they had the music for the upper class. So the music for the peasants was more of the African culture, more of the drums and the rhythmic beating. And the music of the higher class was kind of the Spanish music. Anything that was in Spanish, anything more faster, more, I hate to say tango, but just more of that Latin American culture vibe. So, and I thought that was interesting too. So Cuba was originally a representative democracy, though that changed with many of its leaders. At the end of World War II, the Americans were concerned with communism spreading, and the union of the Cuban government and the Soviets caused everyone to wonder, worry. Anyway, so a little bit of background on me. So I'm from Houston. I grew up right next to NASA, and so I did a few internships there just growing up and through high school. And I was an engineering student. I went into physics, and so I've just really been into like NASA and just that field. And I've built several rockets, and that's just been a hobby of mine. Anyway, so I was growing up, I was very, very into the Soviet Union. Anyway, and I thought that the way that they did the space race was amazing. Just I thought that they, even though they really didn't have a lot on us, they didn't have a lot of advantages on us. I definitely preferred them just because of their resourcefulness. I won't go into too much of that because Soviets. We're talking about Cuba, so but anyway, just and my husband and I are both very pro-government now, and just based off of our own past experiences. My husband was a self-proclaimed communist for several years in high school, and we just have had our own like journeys exploring and discovering what we believe personally and what we think would help help society really like benefit everyone. And so just doing this paper and kind of just learning more overall taught me how, I guess, wrong I was to assume that the Soviets were good at everything. So earlier I mentioned that the sports were kind of just like disorganized and didn't last very long, and that's pretty much how everything else went too. So they were originally a democracy. This, it was great. It was awesome just because of different leaders that eventually fell away. We went into the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the United States was really freaked out because the end of World War II meant that, we knew what communism was. We were scared of genocide, scared of tyrannical leaders. And so when Russia and Cuba teamed up, Russia wanted to, well, I'm sorry, the Soviet Union wanted to kind of one up the United States. And so they moved missiles into Cuba. And the missiles being in just the Soviet Union meant that they really couldn't reach the United States. Moving them into Cuba was just a huge red flag. So it just, led to the Cold War and all these things happening. And this just reminded me of the HBO series Chernobyl. With Chernobyl, I read a book. I read that a book on it a little bit ago, and watched the HBO documentary series. Well, anyway, and it mentioned that the reason why Chernobyl happened, the big explosion, like 6,000 people died. The reason that happened is because there were so many people working that night. None of them were very experienced or trained. They didn't really give a damn about how they were trained, if they were qualified. They just wanted to grow and grow and grow and grow their society and just show how much they had grown and how well off they were. They kind of had Napoleon syndrome. They wanted to overcompensate for their lack of food and the lack of healthcare, lack of how well they were taking care of their people. And so they wanted to show off to the United States, to all these foreign powers. So because of this, you had all these different things happen that just showed the complete detriment of their countries. So this happened with Chernobyl and the Soviet Union, and then this happened again with Cuba. They had all these high hopes to be really good in baseball and to be really good in government and politics, and it just kind of all crashed and failed. So it this they kind of just collapsed. This led to its eventual downfall. Today, Cuba is again a republic with help from the United States. Cubans are very friendly, according to the Global Affairs Canada website. And so I did kind of look into this website. It is pretty credible. I was kind of wondering, for me, the stereotype, I think that Cubans are probably really uptight, really to themselves, closed off, just because of that oppressive government. That's probably what they know to do. And maybe this website just says that they're really nice because this website is from Canada, and Canada is really nice. Anyway, but from this website, it says that there are a lot, so Cuba is a lot more willing to learn about other cultures. And the culture has become a lot more open in the past several years, just after being under Fidel Castro. A common topic among Cubans is the political and economic situation in the country. Nowadays, people speak more openly about it than before, which I think is awesome. If you're a foreigner, people would try to explain some things that might not be obvious to you right away, such as how the country works or how to do things the Cuban way. However, try to be neutral in your opinion and just listen at first, since your opinion's from an outsider's point of view. A good starting point would be to let the Cuban person know why you're in the country. Cubans are very helpful and will try and assist in every way. Sometimes they can appear a little too intrusive as they assist. Cubans, so they're known to be very social about what they feel. They're very expressive. They're very loud. I think this is probably another thing that's probably passed on from the Spaniard culture. What I've personally seen, the Spaniards are very loud, very expressive, very very nice and boisterous and very fun. And so just, an outsider looking in might be a little taken aback by that, a little freaked out. So they're very nice, relaxed, forgiving with deadlines, and relaxed with clothes because it's hot weather and things with them. They focus more on personal relationships than on the normal, managerial relationships, and just things in the workplace relax. when people get to know each other, which I thought was interesting too. I expected them to be more rigid, but they're kind of just like the United States from what I've seen. They are very relaxed. Cubans prefer personal relationships to formal. In the workplace, things relax when superiors and subordinates get to know each other and kind of just mesh better. I think we could definitely be more open to those around us, like Cuba. Um, I think it just makes things easier to communicate. So just as I was reading this, personally, I see more of a divide here in the United States between political opinions. So while I'm at work, I kind of have to feel out people around me and see what they feel about certain issues and how they feel about different political leaders. And when I feel out how they are, then I feel more open to speaking about my own relationships and my own feelings. And I think if we could, adopt their culture of just kind of understanding and learning and growing and moving on, kind of taking the gap between our two very distinct political opinions and just bringing them together and working together to understand both of them more first, I think it would make a lot more sense. It would probably help us grow as a nation faster, be less polarized, and also just make things a lot more comfortable, a lot easier to just learn more. I find this especially from my family because I grew up in Houston, and then I married my husband, and he's a liberal. So we kind of have learned a lot as we've come together and just kind of have chilled out and learned from each other and just not assumed things that we've learned based off of past stereotypes and things that we've seen from most likely not as trustworthy of sources. Anyway, so um, thanks for watching and have a great finals week.